A broken doll, a shattered life, and a shocking act of revenge that echoed across the nation. This is the sensational case of Catherine Denino, a young girl whose tragic story began in the crowded streets of early 20th century America. Born as Chiara Schipa on March 26, 1910, in Bari, Italy, Catherine was just a child when her family migrated to the United States, joining waves of Italian immigrants seeking a better life. They carried little more than hope as they arrived at Ellis Island, dreaming of escaping poverty and building a future in the land of opportunity. Catherine's father, Antonio, and her mother, Maria, settled with their 3 children, Salvatore, Rosa, and Catherine, in a tight-knit Italian-American community. These neighborhoods, often called Little Italiés, were places of shared traditions, but they were also filled with hardships. Italian immigrants worked tirelessly in industries like construction and factories, enduring long hours and low wages, while holding on to their rich culture through food, festivals, and language. At first, the Schipa family managed to scrape by, finding some stability amidst the challenges. Catherine, though young, adjusted quickly to her new life, learning English and attending school. For a time, it seemed as though the family had found its footing. But in 1916, when Catherine was only 6 years old, her world began to fall apart. Her father, Antonio, was arrested and convicted for assault. He spent 10 months in prison, leaving Maria to care for the children alone. The burden of raising 3 children without a stable income was heavy, and Maria's struggles deepened when Antonio, upon his release, passed away unexpectedly. The loss of Antonio devastated the family. Maria, determined to provide for her children, turned their modest home into a boarding house, taking in tenants to supplement her income. She also began working grueling hours in a local factory, enduring back-breaking labor and harsh conditions. Despite her efforts, life was a constant struggle. Catherine grew up watching her mother sacrifice everything to keep the family afloat, but the absence of her father left an emotional void that could never be filled. Among the boarders who moved into the family's home was a man named Luigi Fano, a distant relative. Luigi was a tile setter by trade, earning a modest income, and was generally seen as polite and well-mannered. To most, he appeared dependable, someone who carried himself with quiet respectability. At first, Luigi treated Catherine kindly, asking about her school day and sharing stories about his work. But as time went on, Catherine began to notice something unsettling about him. It started subtly, a lingering gaze, a tone of voice that felt too intense. Catherine tried to dismiss her feelings, thinking perhaps she was imagining things. Yet, the unease grew, leaving her on edge whenever Luigi was nearby. What had once seemed like harmless friendliness began to take on a more disconcerting tone, one that Catherine couldn't ignore. This quiet discomfort reached its breaking point on a day that would change Catherine's life forever. Luigi returned home earlier than usual while Catherine was alone in the house. As she stood in one of the rooms, she felt his presence before she saw him. He approached her with that same unsettling intensity she had noticed for months. Catherine froze, her fear paralyzing her as she realized his intentions. Desperate to escape, she ran from room to room, trying to evade him. Her heart pounded as she searched for a way out, but Luigi was relentless. When he finally cornered her, Catherine grabbed a nearby poker in a frantic attempt to defend herself. The clash between them was chaotic and terrifying, the sound of the poker clattering to the floor echoing through the empty house. What happened next remains shrouded in grim and unspeakable details, leaving much to speculation and sorrow. Catherine later recalled that the memory of the attack was a haze of terror and struggle. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the floor, her mother Maria kneeling beside her, her face etched with worry and shock. Maria had returned home to find her daughter bruised and trembling, with clear signs of what had transpired. Evidence of the struggle was scattered around the room. Maria acted swiftly. Luigi was immediately thrown out of the house, but when it came to seeking justice, Maria faced an agonizing decision. She chose not to press charges against Luigi. In Maria's mind, the fear of scandal loomed larger than the need for justice. She worried that going to the authorities would lead to public shame and gossip, tarnishing Catherine's reputation forever. Maria believed that any legal process would re-traumatize her daughter and subject her to the harsh judgment of society. In her heart, Maria thought silence was the lesser of two evils, even if it meant allowing a terrible crime to go unpunished. This decision carried a heavy burden. For Catherine, it was a bitter silence that forced her to suppress her pain and anger. For Maria, it was the weight of guilt, knowing she had chosen to shield her family from public scrutiny rather than seek justice for her daughter. The attack and its aftermath left an indelible mark on Catherine's life, shaping her in ways that would manifest years later in a moment of desperate vengeance. The aftermath of that horrifying day left Catherine struggling to find a semblance of normalcy. The physical scars began to heal, but the emotional wounds remained fresh and deep. In the silence forced upon her by her mother's decision, Catherine was left to navigate a world where her voice had been stripped away. Each day brought reminders of the attack, and every shadow seemed to carry the presence of Luigi. Yet the most haunting memory was not the man himself, but the doll. The doll had been a gift, a symbol of Catherine's innocence and the fleeting moments of joy in her young life. During the attack, Luigi had ripped it from her hands and smashed it, shattering not just the toy, but something far deeper within her. To Catherine, that moment became a defining image of everything she had lost: her safety, her trust, and the simple joys of childhood. It was a memory that would remain with her, growing into an obsession that she could never escape. 9 months after the attack, Catherine faced yet another devastating ordeal. At just 12 years old, she gave birth to a baby boy. Maria, desperate to shield the family from suspicion and societal scorn, made the decision to keep the matter secret. The baby was quietly taken away and given up for adoption to close family friends, Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Facio, who raised him as their own. Catherine was told that the child had died shortly after birth, a cruel lie meant to protect her from the stigma of being an unwed mother. Maria believed she was acting in her daughter's best interest, but the decision only added to Catherine's growing burden. The secret weighed heavily on her, a reminder of the pain she had endured and the life she had brought into the world, only to have it taken away. Maria urged Catherine never to speak of the baby again, and with a heavy heart, Catherine complied. She tried to move on, but the silence was suffocating, and her unresolved trauma festered beneath the surface. As the years passed, Catherine occasionally crossed paths with Luigi. Despite her attempts to avoid him, he seemed to linger on the edges of her life, a constant reminder of her pain. Each encounter filled her with dread, but also a growing sense of anger. The sight of him, so unbothered by the suffering he had caused, was unbearable. Catherine's hatred for Luigi began to simmer, quietly consuming her as she struggled to find her place in a world that had failed to protect her. When Catherine was 16, her life seemed to take a brighter turn. A young man named Rocco Denino entered her life, offering her a glimpse of happiness she had not known since childhood. Rocco was kind and hardworking, and his genuine interest in Catherine gave her a sense of hope. Despite her troubled past, she allowed herself to dream of a better future. In July of that year, the two married, and Catherine left her mother's home to begin a new chapter. For a brief time, Catherine felt a sense of relief. Rocco's presence offered her stability, and their shared dreams of building a life together gave her something to look forward to. The couple moved to Evanston, Illinois, hoping to leave behind the shadows of the past. But the respite was short-lived. Somehow, Luigi had discovered their new location. Before long, threatening letters began to arrive. At first, the letters were directed at Catherine, filled with veiled threats and cruel reminders of her past. Then Luigi turned his attention to Rocco, demanding money in exchange for his silence. He threatened to expose Catherine's shame to Rocco's friends and family, promising to ruin the couple's reputation if they did not comply. At first, Rocco dismissed the threats, reassuring Catherine that Luigi's words meant nothing. But as the letters grew more frequent and menacing, his confidence began to waver. The weight of the threats became too much for Rocco to bear, and in a moment of frustration and desperation, he lashed out at Catherine. Blaming her for their troubles, he ordered her to leave their home. Heartbroken and feeling utterly abandoned, Catherine had no choice but to leave. Alone and tormented by the memories of her trauma, Catherine fled to Chicago to stay with friends. The bitterness and pain of her past, coupled with Rocco's rejection, pushed her into a dark and dangerous state of mind. She found herself consumed by thoughts of Luigi, replaying the events of that terrible day over and over. The image of her shattered doll haunted her, a symbol of everything he had taken from her. The rage that had simmered inside Catherine for years now began to boil over. She realized that she could no longer live under the shadow of her past, or the constant fear of Luigi's threats. For the first time, she resolved to take control of her life, even if it meant confronting her deepest fears. Catherine borrowed a revolver from a friend, along with a pair of dark-rimmed glasses she thought might serve as a simple disguise. With the little money she had left, she purchased a train ticket to New York. Catherine's mind was made up. She had no intention of running anymore. Instead, she was determined to face the man who had destroyed her life and exact the justice that had been denied to her. The train ride to New York was long and filled with tension. Catherine sat quietly, clutching the revolver hidden in her bag, her mind racing with memories of the past and the plan she was about to execute. For years, she had lived under the weight of fear and humiliation, but now, for the first time, she felt a grim sense of control. She wasn't running anymore. She was heading straight toward the source of her pain. Catherine arrived in New York on a cold Friday afternoon and checked into a cheap hotel. The bustling city streets provided her with anonymity as she began her search for Luigi Fegno. Despite the enormity of her decision, she moved with purpose, careful not to draw attention to herself. She asked discreet questions, talking to people who might know Luigi's whereabouts. Her efforts paid off when she learned that every Saturday, Luigi visited a barber shop on 149th Street in the Bronx. Armed with this information, Catherine set her plan into motion. The next day, Catherine arrived early and positioned herself across the street from the barber shop. She wore the dark-rimmed glasses she had borrowed, hoping they would make her less recognizable. The revolver remained hidden beneath her coat. Hours passed as she sat silently, her eyes fixed on the shop. She didn't eat, drink, or move, her focus entirely consumed by the task ahead. The minutes stretched into hours, but Catherine's resolve never wavered. Finally, after 9 long hours, she saw him. Luigi Fegno emerged from the barber shop, freshly groomed, his hair slicked back and shining in the afternoon light. He walked with his usual arrogance, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing just a short distance away. Catherine's heart pounded as she followed him from a safe distance, her hand instinctively gripping the revolver under her coat. The streets were busy, filled with the noise of people going about their day. Catherine waited, her gaze never leaving Luigi as he made his way down the sidewalk. When they reached a quieter stretch, away from the crowd, Catherine made her move. She called out his name, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Luigi." He stopped and turned, his face registering surprise. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. In that instant, Catherine pulled the revolver from beneath her coat and fired. The first shot struck Luigi in the chest, causing him to stagger backward. He raised his arm as if to shield himself, but Catherine fired again. The second shot sent him collapsing to the ground. The street, once bustling with activity, erupted into chaos as bystanders screamed and ran for safety. But Catherine wasn't done. She stepped closer, her hands steady, and fired a third shot, ensuring that Luigi would never rise again. Amid the commotion, a police officer arrived on the scene. Catherine stood over Luigi's lifeless body, calm and expressionless. She handed the revolver to the officer and, in a voice devoid of emotion, said, "He broke my doll." The officer, bewildered by her words, didn't immediately understand their depth. But for Catherine, those 4 words encapsulated years of pain, trauma, and betrayal. Luigi Fegno was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The story of his death spread quickly, and by the next day, newspapers across New York were buzzing with headlines about the shocking incident. But as reporters dug deeper into the case, the painful truth about Catherine's past began to surface. What had initially seemed like a straightforward murder case revealed a far more complex and tragic story. The public's reaction was immediate and intense. Some condemned Catherine's actions, arguing that she had taken the law into her own hands. But many others sympathized with her, seeing her as a victim driven to desperation by years of suffering and relentless harassment. Letters poured into the newspapers, with readers expressing their support for the young girl who had endured so much. Many believed that Luigi Fano had earned his fate, and Catherine's act was one of justice, not vengeance. As Catherine sat in her jail cell, awaiting her fate, the full weight of what she had done began to settle in. She had faced her worst fear and silenced the man who had tormented her for so long. But the consequences of her actions loomed large. She had confessed to the crime and surrendered the murder weapon, leaving no doubt about her guilt. The law was clear, and Catherine now faced the possibility of the ultimate punishment, the electric chair. But Catherine's story wasn't over yet. As the details of her case unfolded, they caught the attention of powerful figures who would change the course of her trial and her life. The sensational case of Catherine Denino was just beginning to captivate the nation. The day after Catherine Denino's arrest, newspapers across New York plastered her story on their front pages. The headlines were bold and shocking, describing the murder of Luigi Fano in vivid detail. But as reporters delved deeper, the narrative began to shift. Catherine's past, the attack, the broken doll, the hidden pregnancy, and Luigi's relentless harassment came to light, painting a tragic portrait of a young girl pushed beyond her breaking point. Public opinion, once divided, began to sway in her favor. Among those moved by Catherine's plight was a man who knew all too well the harsh glare of public judgment. Harry Thaw, a millionaire with a notorious past, became one of her most outspoken supporters. 2 decades earlier, Thaw had made headlines for the murder of architect Stanford White, a crime he claimed was to defend his wife's honor. Now, seeing parallels between his own story and Catherine's, Thaw offered substantial financial support for her defense. He hired a team of skilled attorneys and set aside $5,000, a significant sum at the time, to ensure Catherine had a fair trial. Thaw's involvement turned Catherine's case into a national sensation. His wealth and notoriety brought even more attention to her story, drawing both sympathy and scandal. Child welfare advocates, social reformers, and even prominent political figures joined the growing chorus of voices calling for mercy. Among them was Sophie Loeb, president of the Child Welfare Committee of America, who publicly advocated on Catherine's behalf. Loeb's heartfelt testimony about Catherine's suffering and the systemic failures that led to her desperate act resonated with the public. Margaret Woodrow Wilson, daughter of the late President Woodrow Wilson, also lent her support. She attended Catherine's court hearings, using her influence to highlight the young girl's plight. To many, Catherine was not just a defendant. She was a symbol of the hidden struggles faced by vulnerable young women in a society that often turned a blind eye to their pain. Meanwhile, Catherine was held without bail, facing the possibility of the electric chair. The prosecution had a strong case. She had confessed to the murder, handed over the weapon, and admitted her intent. But her defense team, bolstered by Thaw's resources and the growing public support, worked tirelessly to shift the narrative. They presented the threatening letters Luigi had sent to Catherine and her husband, exposing his blackmail attempts and his persistent harassment. The letters painted Luigi as a manipulative predator who had tormented Catherine for years, turning her act of violence into one of desperation rather than cold-blooded murder. Catherine's emotional state became a central focus of her defense. Psychiatrists who examined her described the deep psychological scars left by Luigi's attack when she was just 12 years old. They spoke of how the memory of the broken doll had haunted her, serving as a symbol of her shattered innocence. The defense drew comparisons to tragic literary figures, noting how Catherine's trauma had consumed her and ultimately led to her breaking point. As the trial progressed, Catherine's tragic story captivated the nation. Letters of support poured in from across the country, many from women who shared their own experiences of suffering in silence. Some saw Catherine as a victim of a flawed society, where women and children were often left to fend for themselves. Others believed her actions were justified, arguing that Luigi's death was the inevitable result of his cruelty. Even the judge and district attorney appeared sympathetic to Catherine's plight. During her plea, Catherine spoke with a blunt honesty that struck a chord with those in the courtroom. "He was frightened when he saw me," she said, describing the moment she confronted Luigi. "Thank God he saw me shoot him." Her words, though chilling, carried an undeniable weight, reflecting years of pent-up fear and anger. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the trial neared its conclusion. Catherine's lawyers argued that she had acted out of years of suffering and relentless torment. The prosecution, while acknowledging Luigi's wrongdoing, maintained that murder was still a crime. It was a complex case, one that blurred the lines between justice and vengeance, victim and perpetrator. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, their support for Catherine growing louder with each passing day. Some carried signs demanding her freedom, while others prayed for mercy. Catherine, once a silent and terrified girl, had become a symbol of resilience, her story a rallying cry for change. The trial's outcome would not only decide Catherine's fate, but also serve as a reflection of the society that had failed to protect her. As the jury prepared to deliberate, the nation held its breath, waiting to see whether Catherine would be condemned for her actions, or granted the compassion she so desperately needed. The courtroom fell silent as the jury delivered their decision. Catherine Denino, the 16-year-old girl at the center of one of the most sensational cases in the country, was allowed to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter rather than face a murder charge. The verdict reflected the complexities of her case, acknowledging the crime she committed while considering the relentless trauma and suffering that had driven her to it. The judge's words during sentencing left a lasting impression. He described Catherine as a victim of betrayal, not only by Luigi Fano, but also by her own mother. In a stern yet compassionate tone, he condemned Maria's failure to protect her daughter and the decisions that had left Catherine so vulnerable. Had the mother of this unfortunate child fulfilled her responsibilities, the judge declared, this tragedy might never have happened. His words cut deeply, not just for Maria but for everyone in the courtroom, as he underscored the weight of parental duty and its far-reaching consequences. Catherine was sentenced to a suspended term and placed under probation, a decision that sparked both relief and debate. For many, the ruling was an act of mercy, a recognition of the unimaginable circumstances that had shaped her life. For others, it was a sign of leniency in a case where the law should have been absolute. Regardless of the differing opinions, the verdict allowed Catherine to avoid the electric chair and gave her a chance to rebuild her life. During her probation, Catherine was sent to Bellevue Hospital's psychiatric ward for evaluation. There, she underwent extensive psychological assessments, which revealed the depth of her trauma. The psychiatrist concluded that Catherine had been profoundly affected by the events of her childhood, particularly the attack at the age of 12. The broken doll, they noted, had become a symbol of her suffering, representing her stolen innocence and the emotional wounds that never fully healed. While at Bellevue, Catherine received an unexpected visitor, her husband, Rocco Denino. Despite their earlier estrangement, Rocco had returned, his guilt over abandoning her evident in his actions. He brought gifts and news that she was pregnant again, a revelation that brought both hope and complexity to their relationship. For the first time in years, Catherine allowed herself to dream of a better future, one where she might find happiness despite the shadows of her past. "All my life I never knew a happy Christmas," she told Rocco tearfully. "This one will be my happiest." Yet the past had more surprises in store. Dorothy Frew, one of Catherine's defense attorneys, made a startling discovery. Catherine's first child, the baby she had been told had died, was alive and well. The boy had been adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Fazio, who named him Alfred and raised him in New Jersey. When the child was brought to meet Catherine, she struggled to process the revelation. "I only saw it for a moment," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I was too young to remember it. I suffered too much. How can I feel love for it?" The meeting brought a mix of sorrow and closure, another layer to the complicated story of Catherine's life. As the public followed these developments, sympathy for Catherine only grew. Her case had become a lightning rod for discussions about justice, trauma, and the treatment of women in society. High-profile figures like Margaret Woodrow Wilson continued to show their support, attending hearings and advocating for leniency. Letters flooded the court and newspapers, with many calling Catherine a victim who had been failed by those around her. When the trial concluded, Catherine expressed her gratitude to the court and her supporters. She acknowledged the second chance she had been given and vowed to move forward with her life. On January 9, 1927, she was released from custody and allowed to return to Evanston with Rocco. The couple hoped to leave the past behind and focus on their future, building a life that offered Catherine the peace she had long sought. Catherine's release marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, but the weight of her past never fully left her. She returned to Evanston with Rocco, who had recommitted to their marriage after the tumultuous trial. Together, they worked to rebuild their lives, holding on to the fragile hope that they could create a better future. Despite the challenges they faced, Catherine found some solace in the quiet life they built and the growing family they nurtured. Over the years, Catherine and Rocco welcomed 2 children together. Their home in Evanston became a place where Catherine could focus on the role of wife and mother, trying to provide her children with the stability and care she had lacked in her own childhood. But even as she embraced her new life, the shadows of her past lingered. The memory of her confrontation with Luigi, the years of torment, and the haunting image of the broken doll stayed with her, a reminder of the girl she once was and the trials she had endured. The public fascination with Catherine's story slowly faded, but it left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the nation. Her case had sparked discussions about the deep flaws in society's treatment of women and children, highlighting how neglect and trauma could lead to tragic outcomes. Advocacy groups used her story as a call to action, pushing for better protections for vulnerable individuals and greater accountability for those who preyed on them. Catherine's life after the trial was far from easy, but she demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. She worked alongside Rocco to provide for their family, remaining out of the public eye as much as possible. Despite her troubled past, she found moments of happiness in the everyday acts of motherhood and marriage. Her ability to move forward, even with the scars of her trauma, was a testament to her strength and determination. Catherine Denino passed away on September 27, 1992, at the age of 82. Her life, marked by both tragedy and resilience, remained a poignant example of the long-lasting effects of trauma and the human capacity to endure. For those who remembered her story, Catherine was more than just the girl who pulled the trigger. She was a symbol of survival, a reflection of a society that had failed her, and a reminder of the importance of justice and compassion. Her story continues to echo in history, a haunting yet powerful tale of how pain, silence, and injustice can shape a life. Catherine Denino's name may have faded from the headlines, but the lessons of her life remain relevant, urging us to protect the vulnerable and ensure that no one is left to face their struggles alone. Thank you for following the heartbreaking story of Catherine Denino. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical true crime stories.